The story of the gladiator is one of the most common things portrayed in our pop culture. Time and time again, we see these savage fights recreated on the big and the small screens. But why though? Why is this story so popular that we see it over and over again? And for that matter, why was watching these fights so popular in the first place? Well, to answer that, we have to go all the way back to ancient Rome, to 264 BCE. Ancient Rome used gladiator fights as their primary form of entertainment. Public arenas, most famously the Colosseum, would be filled to the brim with patrons wanting to watch the carnage. A lot of times, the fights were used to mark special occasions for the Roman Empire, particularly the ends of wars and battles. Many gladiators were actually prisoners of war, and thus they were believed to be the perfect gladiatorial candidates due to their previous combat training and skills with various weapons. Many criminals and slaves were also sentenced to become gladiators, but usually attended some sort of training before they were forced to fight. Most of the time, the fights ended in the death of the losing combatant. If the fight did not end in a killing strike, then the emperor got to decide the fighter's fate. Every single time the emperor had to make a decision on a fighter's fate, the crowd would scream and cheer and try to influence him as much as they could. And more often than not, the crowd wanted blood. The emperor usually ignored the crowd and let them live. These warriors were seen as sort of an investment. As the tradition progressed, however, a sense of honor and glory came with victory, and individuals actually began volunteering to participate in these games. But why were these fights so popular? Why did time and time again so many people turn out to come watch these? Ignoring the fact that society was not as humane or as evolved as we would have liked, the main reason is the distraction it provided. Ancient Rome was rampant with disease, crime, poverty, and war. The emperors all believed that by providing citizens with these fights to watch, it would serve as a good distraction and would squash any ideas of rebelling. Whether it's movies, novels, TV shows, or comic books, gladiators have been one of the most common story tropes ever embraced by our media. This story trope can be presented in two different ways. One is the historical depiction that literally tells a story about a gladiator in ancient Rome. This is the very literal, classic presentation. Historical depictions of ancient Rome have been a hot commodity on the big screen since the days of silent film. The original Ben-Hur was made back in 1925 and was indeed a silent film. That famous novel has been adapted into film 3 times in the last 90 years, with the most recent one coming out just last year. Historical films and TV shows based on ancient Rome continue to be released, proving that the masses are not yet tired of the historical depiction. Whether they are romanticized depictions or not doesn't really matter. They are still stories about ancient Rome and the gladiator fights that took place there. The second way the story is presented is when a film or a TV show that has nothing to do with ancient Rome recreates the idea of gladiator fights. In this form, the gladiator fight survives more as an idea. The word gladiator usually is not even mentioned in this second form. Shows, books, and movies that present the story of the gladiator in this form are usually mediums that center around the supernatural or the futuristic. Obviously, since we don't have actual gladiator fights in today's society, the only believable representation of gladiator fights that could take place thousands of years after ancient Rome must take place in alternate settings. The Hunger Games is a great example of this alternate setting depiction. Here we have a dystopian futuristic society that enslaves children and trains them to kill each other and publicly watch combat. The Hunger Games were put in place by this world's government for the same reason the Roman Empire did their games. It was meant to suppress any ideas of ever revolting. Everything that happens in this movie is a perfect example of world building. The more we see of this war-torn, poverty-stricken society with this fascist government, the more the audience believes that this futuristic society would create these games that resemble ancient gladiator fights. While this alternate setting depiction is popular among film, it's even more popular among television. So popular, in fact, that almost every single sci-fi, superhero, or supernatural show has had at least one gladiator episode.
A gladiator episode would basically be where a character is captured, usually against his or her will, and then they are put in an arena to fight someone, usually to the death. This comes from, of course, ancient gladiators in ancient Rome, where basically it would be slaves, people who were sold by their debt collectors because they couldn't pay it. Yeah, that was their form of a debtor's prison. Or just like anyone. Back then, the gladiator was, yeah, they were slaves, but they were actually kind of a superstar. However, you don't really see that in like episodes that use the gladiator trope today. Examples of people who have used that trope, I can imagine. I remember there was an episode of Invader Zim where he was captured and they had to fight. There was a year-long comic book arc in the Hulk series where he went to an alien planet and they fought using gladiators. There was an episode of Angel, there was an episode of Justice League. Pretty much any superhero I can think has had at least one gladiator combat. A bunch of anime, it's basically spread out through all forms of media. Marvin the Martian, one of the Looney Tunes, is portrayed in classic gladiator fare, so the trope has been there since at least the early 40s, probably to say that he's some sort of conqueror. My favorite example would be the Dark Tournament arc from Yu Yu Hakusho. It involved, again, a team of characters, the main characters, being forced to basically fight to the death in a 5 or 6 round tournament. And it's the longest arc in that series, and for many people, it's usually their favorite as well. I wouldn't say that most uses of the trope are accurate, because it wasn't just like gladiator battles to the death. Because back then, it was basically any form of entertainment. They would show like wild cats in there. I remember seeing this movie, it's called Pompeii, and it has Kit Harington, who plays, of course, Jon Snow in Game of Thrones, and he's a captured gladiator. And they actually use him to like do an entertainment recreation of a battle. So it was like a history movie to them. Only the people who played the defeated army were real people who were killed. And they did in fact do that as well. I think we come back to the trope because, I mean, if you look in media, film, television, it's a visual media. And visual media usually responds best to action. So it's a very, I'm not gonna say cheap, but it's a very easy way to set up fights and tension without much time needed for explanation.
Whether you find the Gladiator story in a film based off of a young adult novel, in a cartoon meant for children, or in the bloodiest, most brutal action show imaginable, the story is still the same. It's a fierce look at the human condition. You see unparalleled determination in those who are forced to partake in these games, and then you get to see the mentality of a stadium filled with people cheering on while 2 men kill each other. Both the historical depiction and the alternate setting depiction will most likely be around forever. Audiences have shown no signs of getting tired of this genre, and there is really a lot you can do with the material. It's one of my favorite genres, and I think a lot of other people feel the same.